and welcome to our session, A New Era in US-EU Relations. We've been listening a lot about it in the last 2 days. Hopefully this 20 minutes will be more enlightening for you because we have a really special guest. Thank you so much for being here. Jenna, Ben-Yehuda, Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council. I will give my personal opinion here. I think you're one of our biggest strategic minds at the moment, and boy, do we need more female strategic voices in the world of today. Welcome to Delphi. So, since 20th of January, we witnessed like a real bombardment from DC, from I don't know, J.D. Vance speeches in Munich, in Paris. We saw how Zelensky was treated in the White House, and at the end, Greenland buy-off offer, and of course the tariffs, talk of the day. How would you map where are we now, and what can we expect?
Well, thank you, Ivana. It's great to be here with all of you. I think certainly the last 2.5 months have felt like decades worth of history. Try living in Washington. But I would posit that this started well before January. Of course, this is President Trump's second term, and we see echoes certainly of the first term. We know that Trump has used tariffs as a tool, as a cudgel, as sanctions. He's been interested in that kind of policy since the 80s. So while certainly the last 2.5 months have been, I think, a shock and awe opener to this second term of the presidency, so much of this has been laid as groundwork, not just dating from the first term, but decades back. So we see a lot of these same themes resurgent. But I think to anybody who was wondering if this was rhetoric or if this was going to actually have policy implications, I think we now have our answer.
We now have 90 days pause, but you said, I think yesterday, we had a dinner that basically there is no coming back after this 90 days. So we heard the stances from both sides, especially in European Union. Yesterday, Ursula von der Leyen said that, you know, if this continues, EU will basically tax first and foremost American big tech. So what can we expect after the 90 days? Can we expect some, you know, deals before, or what's your assessment at this current moment?
Well, if we think back just to April 2nd on Liberation Day, and I think our period of liberation lasted...
And we met the day after Liberation Day in Washington.
That's right. Our liberation lasted about 6.5 days until the pause. So thinking about where things are going to be 90 days from now, you know, we need that. We're well positioned to be in Delphi to kind of look for those signs into the future and where the past can lead us. So I think a lot can happen between now and then. And the good news for Europe is that China is now in the hot seat. So certainly, I would say, don't consider this, you know, that everything is off. Maybe it's a pause. It's a chance to take a breath and to be thoughtful about what tools are at the disposal. I think President von der Leyen's been very thoughtful in this regard. The big news, of course, right now is China and how much of this is, how this is managed and how this works. Worth noting also that the pain for the US, considering the dramatically high now tariff rates on China, even to bring other countries to that 10% level, has huge price consequences for the US. So as we've seen markets respond favorably to the news of the pause, I think we could regard that as a collective kind of moment of relief. But don't expect that to endure, because we'll see what this the price consequences mean for the American economy, which has already shown some substantial signs of stress. So we could be in a very different place 90 days from now than where we are now. But certainly it does give the EU a little bit of time to start doing its homework and thinking about planning.
Trump basically believes that, you told me that once that current global institutional system created strategic disadvantages for the US. We know the story about the trade deficit, the US deficit, but do you think that this is the only way to correct this, through this kind of art of a deal that we're seeing the last 2.5 months?
Yeah. So, look, I think it's tempting when you look purely at national growth rates to think of the United States as a wealthy country with a strong economy, and certainly that is true. But if we peel back the onion a little bit and we look at the nature of U.S. economic growth and where those pockets of wealth exist, we see a more complex story. And I would posit that the part of the impetus for Trump's popularity, and recall he did win the popular vote in the United States, the support is there for him, not by a landslide, but certainly won that fair and square, and that was not disputed, comes, I think, from this long-standing kind of jobless recovery dating from 2008. A lot of people feel dispossessed in this moment of growth. Levels of inequality are the highest in a generation. So there are a lot of Americans who rightfully feel left behind in this story of economic growth. And this has been a stronghold for where Trump's support has existed, especially within what we call the Rust Belt in the United States, what had been the kind of halcyon days of manufacturing throughout the Midwest, which is largely, in many instances, kind of shuttered factories and manufacturing capacity from days of yore. So there is a correction, a call for where am I, where is my access to wealth, that this Trumpian philosophy seeks to rectify, that I think is not necessarily visible in Europe when you look at U.S. from afar and the top line numbers of what is a really impressive history of growth, especially compared to some, frankly, lackluster growth indicators across Europe, right?
Talking about inequality and this sentiment of the Americans and why Trump won the second time last year, you mentioned last night this Chicago Council poll on basically that the support for U.S., let's say, engagement abroad is at lowest point in the last half of the century. So I would like to move to the issue of defense. We're celebrating 80 years since the end of World War. This year, we're talking about the changing international order. How does this fit into this story about what is the world we are going to experience from this ground zero?
Yeah, look, I started my career in Washington really in the shadow of 9/11. I was working at State Department at the time. I heard that second plane hit the Pentagon. So my own career story is one of growing up in the aftermath of those attacks and the U.S. foray into Iraq and Afghanistan. We have a legacy of 20 years of war in the United States, which I think is sometimes not necessarily visible in Europe in the same way. Indeed, it's not necessarily visible consistently across the U.S. Many Americans don't know somebody who has served in conflict, but the reality is that trillions of dollars of U.S. treasure have been spent for what the American people perceive as not necessarily gains that have improved the lives of Americans. So you see this dip, I think, after protracted wars in the Middle East for U.S. engagement abroad. There's this perpetual question of what does it get us? And at a time of uneven economic growth and distribution, many people are poorer than their parents before them were. There is a real desire for retrenchment, especially as the economy undergoes adjustments and we see continued declines in manufacturing. So this sets the stage a little bit for the kind of dominant notion within the U.S. about questioning its role in the world. But I would also point out that while certainly the tone and tenor of a lot of the messaging out of the Trump administration is quite different than what we saw from former President Biden, the messaging is actually fairly consistent. We saw under President Biden's tenure a tremendous drumbeat pretty consistently to have NATO defense spending increase. And indeed, under President Biden's tenure, the number of countries spending 2% of their GDP on defense increased pretty dramatically. Now, the packaging was rather different, but this has the air a little bit of, as I was trying to explain this to my teenage daughter, it's like, when I ask you to put your jacket on for the first few times, I say, could you please put your jacket on? Could you please put your jacket on? And then it gets to a point where it says, the car is leaving, put a jacket on. And I think you see this bubbling frustration within the Trump administration that there has been a long-standing commitment to the United States not just supporting European defense, but subsidizing it dramatically. If you look at the numbers, it's pretty staggering. And that at a time of a need to invest in American security, I mean, this is part of the strategy here, that it's time for those investments to go elsewhere. I think the problem arises between the gap on capabilities, because you cannot turn around and substitute
immediately
for that kind of capability overnight. So we have cleavages in spending. There is, I think, a widespread understanding that Europe needs to do more. Europe has started to step up, but the question then becomes on whose timeline and how do you address those kinds of gaps? I think some of the answer has to be in you can't do business in the same way. The tender process has to change. There have to be real questions about which nations are going to provide which kinds of capabilities, unprecedented cooperation between NATO and the EU to address some of these questions about who is fielding which kinds of assets and in what way. There's a huge opportunity for innovation in European defense that could leapfrog a lot of what the US defense industrial base has endeavored to grow over the last 15 to 20 years, but that has to come through purposeful commitment and focus.
Ukraine is the war that is European war.
Yeah.
How do you see that United States will continue to act towards Ukraine in terms of defense and assistance?
You know, look, I think it's pretty interesting. Never in my lifetime driving throughout the US have I ever seen Americans more animated by a foreign conflict than in the war in Ukraine. You can drive in upstate New York, through the Midwest, through rural Texas, and you see Ukrainian flags planted in the front yards of American homes. I've seen more Ukrainian flags driving around the US than I've seen American flags in the last 3 years. It's pretty extraordinary. So I think there is something about Russia's war in Ukraine that feels like an American story that is resonant for people. So I think there is this narrative element of it where there is actually tremendous affection for the fight. And we see that reflected in the polling. More Americans believe that more should be done. There is a little bit of a breakdown between interventionism on the one hand. That's one thing to put U.S. boots on the ground, but Americans by and large also believe that Ukraine needs support. If we throw that into the current political context, though, I think this was a huge wake-up call for Europe, right? You know, removing that kind of intel military aid, that was a really tactical, really tangible evidence of, well, maybe this administration is actually pretty serious about that. That has to be a wake-up call for Europe in terms of providing its own defense capability in this moment. And we'll see what these kinds of negotiations yield. I think the jury's out on some of this. But President Trump, for his part, is going to want to deliver on this. The question is, what does the deal look like?
Donald Trump dropped the idea of buy-off of Greenland already in his first mandate, but now it became very serious, and we saw J.D. Vance's visit there. You told me that you find this subject very serious. Why?
This should not be underestimated. I mean, Greenland is of strategic importance to the United States for a number of reasons, not just its geography, obviously, as we look to Arctic security and the nature of what climate change might bring for navigation in the high north and things of that nature. The U.S. has had a long-standing presence of the space station there. But also Greenland is home to about 80% of the critical minerals needed for advanced manufacturing of advanced technologies and weaponry that will be the drivers of the economy of kind of now into the future. And so just as we see other threads related to critical minerals, this was, of course, part of Trump's negotiating tactic with the Ukrainians, with critical mineral deposits within Ukraine. You're seeing this again, this resource element to the national security negotiating element that is also present in the Greenland instance. So I think it's worth paying attention to. Part of the framing of last night's conversation that I thought was really helpful is to actually call this a Trumpian revolution. Because if you just look at these elements in isolation, whether tariffs or Greenland, you could miss the forest for the trees, because There is a broader narrative here at play, which Trump and his team are driving, which is that the U.S. has gotten the short end here and is looking to correct that score. Now, whether or not you believe that is a different matter, but you have to pay attention to it because tariffs are not just, it's not an economic tool in this regard. This really is about dramatically altering the global trading system. We see this too with the shape of alliances and so forth. Taken in that view, you can begin to see how these elements cohere within a broader strategy. I think the important question in this moment then becomes, so what is the narrative for Europe? What is the European story that draws in support, that is unifying? I think we have a pretty clear view of what a Trumpian narrative for America is. So what is Europe's narrative that isn't just Europe in relationship to the United States, but Europe for itself? How do you get young men and women to don the uniforms of their nation and fight for what? For what shared purpose, for what shared cause? I think there's a real opportunity for that, and that kind of unity and shared story is going to be incredibly important in the months and years ahead.
The world revolution is out there, revolution as an overhaul of the institutional system. We're seeing it. We saw it already, basically, as Trump is a leader of right-wing conservative political revolution also and exports these ideas also in Europe. But within the United States, we saw something really unprecedented from turning off, let's say, traditional important international institutions for the US, from USAID to Wilson Center, Voice of America, Institute of Peace, kicking out Associated Press and Reuters from White House Press Corps. Can we then talk that US and Europe basically still constitute the core of liberal world order, or we're done?
We're not done. We're far from done. And I don't think any of this should be shocking for those who've been paying attention to American politics. This has been in the water for some time. I think Republicans have had the U.S. Institute of Peace on the chopping block for its budget every round for the last decade. That it's happened, the way in which it happened was still shocking. But a lot of this commentary has been there for some time. So it's true, you see a retreat from some of this. I think it does have a strong tie to U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and this uneven growth and the need for more broad-based economic growth in the United States, and that there has been a real constituency developed politically that is hungering for answers to that. But I would also offer that there is a very narrow majority within the Congress for the Republican Party. We'll see what the midterms hold. The president's, some of the strongest voices, Republican voices in the Senate, were pretty vocal in their opposition to tariffs. So we've seen some pretty strong early signs that there's opposition, there's not full unity within the party. And there was a very large protest movement in the United States on April 5th, nationwide, cities across the country came out in force. We've also seen a tremendous number of actions taken to the courts. So the notion that this is just kind of moving forward without interruption, I think, is not an entirely accurate depiction, but certainly it's been fast and it's been strong. The United States is a nation of norms. Europe is a continent of rules. If we think about these two elements together, there is an asymmetry there with the nature of cooperation. So thinking about the US in a European context is not helpful always, because you need to think about it as norms being challenged within a uniquely American context. And that's what's happening. We're seeing so much of this bend, but it's not all breaking. It is a moment of tremendous disruption, and they really do see themselves as revolutionaries in that regard.
Talking about revolutionaries and disruption, there's one name I want to address here. That name is Elon Musk. We discussed a lot last couple of days about how Europe is basically lagging behind in terms of competitiveness in the field of technology, but we're good in regulating things. We're the pioneering continent that made AI regulation, DSA, which is very important. But the role of Elon Musk is not just investing in new technologies advancing this world, it really affected our democracy. When he wrote 3 letters, AFD, on his account and pin it up there, it created a shock. Everyone was sitting with J.D. Vance in Munich. So how do you see this leveraging influences through this kind of means by the richest guy in the world and the guy who has a tremendous now effect on the U.S. as the head of the OGE?
Yeah. On the one hand, this is unprecedented for the United States in the modern era, but it's not unprecedented entirely to have that kind of extreme wealth have influence on American politics. In fact, I think that's a pretty old American story in many respects. But in the modern era, certainly it's noteworthy. Look, we'll see. Elon Musk is obviously a very close advisor to the president, and his fingerprints are very clear. He's also taking a step back as Tesla stock tumbles, and there have been huge challenges to his own business. I think it's helpful sometimes to think about President Trump as leading a fractious coalition in some regards. So maybe in that sense, thinking about a European political context can offer a little bit of insight, because there are different veins of policy that run through the administration. Musk is on one side on certain issues, Vance is on another. We see with Elbridge Colby, the incoming Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, a very clear view about the nature of the U.S. role in the world and a real desire to be very focused on China, potentially to the exclusion of European security. Sometimes these views are in contrast with each other, and I think Elon Musk's views are no different. We've seen those rifts within the administration, and I think that will persist. It was a feature of the first term, and I think is sometimes by design the nature of how Trump likes to govern.
We saw how Europe is realigning from Letta Draghi report to Niinistö report to every other action Europe is doing. If Ursula von der Leyen will call you for a cup of coffee this afternoon, like the first-hand Washington consultancy, what would you say to her?
Stay the course and be patient. But now is an opportunity to step up and really offer a vision for Europe that puts Europe at the center and not necessarily the U.S. I think there is a real moment for Europe to have to build a shared narrative of collective purpose, not just vis-a-vis where the U.S. is or where China is positioned, but what is the story of Europe that we want to tell in this century moving forward? Because that is what is going to be needed to really unify the union here, and to bring folks together for collective purpose, because we're in for some really challenging times that I think are going to cut to the heart of beliefs at the national level. So there is a real moment for unity, but within unity, you can't just demand it. There has to be shared purpose. I think she's played a tough hand very, very well. She's a really shrewd politician and tactician and strategist, and I think was quite smart coming out of the gate. Now it's just staying the course and bringing Europe together with her.
Jenna, Ben-Yehuda, our 20 minutes are off. Thank you so much for being in Delphi.